a disadvantage looks like inside of a debate round.
Except in real life.
Except for in real life.
Cable goes out, you get stressed. When you get stressed, you need to get away. When you need to get away, you go for something exotic. When you go for something exotic, you get bitten by something exotic. When you get bitten by something exotic, things swell up. When things swell up, you can't go home. And when you can't go home, you become a local fisherman they call Big Fatty Face. Don't become a local fisherman they call Big Fatty Face. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DirecTV. When you pay too much for cable, you feel down. When you feel down, you stay in bed. When you stay in bed, they give your job to someone new. When they give your job to someone new, he has a lot to learn. When he has a lot to learn, mistakes are made. And when mistakes are made, you get body slammed by a lowland gorilla. Don't get body slammed by a lowland gorilla. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DirecTV.
Okay, can someone tell me why that's really similar to a disadvantage read in the debate round? Yeah. Speak up.
Be louder.
The impact of that. That's it.
Okay, so there's some type of what's happening right now, the uniqueness, status quo. There's a bunch of links. Oh my goodness, there's like 7 that included tons of random small things. And then there's an impact of getting hit by like a giant gorilla or something ridiculous like that. So that's kind of similar to what a disadvantage is inside of the debate round. And after seeing that, you can see how absolutely silly and ridiculous disadvantages sometimes can be, which should make it very easy to answer them, right? Yeah.
So to get maybe an idea of what we need to cover first and maybe where we can skip on to, because not all of you were in the running disadvantages lecture, so is there anything, do we need to cover like what the parts of a disadvantage are, or like what their structure is, or any of those basics, because this lecture is going to assume that all that is already known. So we're good to go in that regard?
Yeah, we can go over the basics really quickly.
Okay, yeah, sure. So
do you want to
yeah, we'll put this up first.
Alright, so tell me once again what you said the parts of the disadvantage were.
There's like the uniqueness of what is going on, what the status quo is.
Maybe a little bit louder.
There's the uniqueness, which is like the status quo, and then there's the link, which is like the link to the impact, and then there's the impact, and it's how
Okay, yeah. The only thing is that there might be more internal links to your impact. Not necessary, but a lot of people have. Alright, can you go over one more time what each of these means? Uniqueness. What is the uniqueness? Go for it.
status quo.
Yeah, the uniqueness is what is happening right now. What is the link?
So if uniqueness describes what is happening now, right, and the app modifies what is happening right now, what does the link have to explain?
Like, always like interpreted as like if the status, like the link is like something where we're not using the status quo, and that's what links the impact, and like the impact is what happens if we like don't keep the status quo.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty similar. So uniqueness is the status quo, what's going on right now. The link is whatever the app does to change the status quo. Alter what's going on right now. And that will lead to other bad things, the internal link, which then lead to the terminal impact, which is the ultimate bad outcome, like being body slammed by a gorilla.
So status quo is U.S.-Japanese relations high, right, describes the way it is now. Link is the app causes Japan to hate the United States because they don't like whatever the app is, right? So it explains what the shift from the status quo is that is caused by the app. Internal link is U.S.-Japanese relations key to cooperation on X environmental treaty. And the impact is that X environmental treaty is key to stopping global warming and extinction. So all the internal link is, right, is the intermediary step between that initial change and the terminal impact.
Does that make sense?
So everybody on the same page in terms of what a disad looks like. Okay? And I guess just an overall general definition about what a disadvantage is. A disadvantage is just it is a harm that is caused by your opponent's advocacy. It's as simple as that. It is a harm, it is a reason why, or it is an event that is caused, a bad event that is caused by doing the app. Right? So everybody on that same page now, we can start talking about types of answers that we can make disads. So the lecture will be broken down into offensive answers and then defensive answers, and then how to kind of combine those answers and what are effective strategies for combining those answers. Because you don't always want to, well, you probably never want to make all of these answers at the same time. Because that can lead to things like double turns, as we'll talk about later, as well as really poor strategic situations where you spend some time generating offense and then you waste all that time by making a couple of defensive responses. We'll go more in depth on that later when we talk about combining offensive and defensive answers, but first we'll just talk about them more broadly. So I think the most direct offensive way to destroy a disadvantage is by link turning the position. Who can define what a link turn is? Just in general, like not necessarily in the context of a disad, just what is a link turn? Yeah. Right, exactly. So same thing applies to disads, right? Using the example we talked about earlier, if the link is that the app kills U.S.-Japanese relations, what would a link turn be? Exactly. App strengthens U.S.-Japanese relations, right? So I think this is the most direct way to destroy a position because you're able to accept the terminal impact and gain exclusive, and if you win the argument, gain exclusive access to their impact, and then prevent the other side from accessing that impact. And then that prevents them from being able to outweigh your link turn with any kind of impact analysis because, ta-da, you can now control what that original impact is. Right? So the strategic value of link turning is, let's say, I mean, they've just invested, whatever, 2 minutes explaining uniqueness link, another internal link, and then an impact, right? And you're able to get rid of all of that with 1 or 2 cards that explain why you control the impact, right? So they spent all this time trying to develop an extinction scenario. Then if you win a link turn, you get access to all that same extinction scenario with 1 card. Does that make sense? So if you think of like strategy and debate in terms of strategic time trade-offs, right? The time trade-off becomes radically in your favor with the link turn strategy because they invest all this time fully developing the disad, and you can gain access to that same exact impact in a quarter of the time. So the next thing I'll say though is that, and we'll talk about making uniqueness presses later. Actually, well, I'll just say straight turning for later. So that is a link turn. Next is the impact turn. So what are impact turns? Yeah.
Like it does leave there no treaty with Japan.
Okay. So that's more of an internal link turn. We'll talk about that in a second. What would an impact turn be?
Focusing right here on the impact.
exactly, something like that. Right. So I'll say impact turn strategies aren't always the best because they're very counterintuitive and the evidence is usually good. But in rare circumstances, it can be a very optimal strategy if the scenario is good. And I'll tell you a war story of mine here in a second. If the judges are receptive to it, and if you don't think your opponent is seeing it coming, it can be very strategic because it'll catch them off guard. They're not going to be prepared to handle the counterintuitive nature of your impact turns. And especially if they haven't saved themselves a lot of prep for the 2NR, it'll really put them back on their feet because then they don't have much time. Assuming the 1AR invests in an impact turn strategy, they're not going to have a lot of time to prepare the 2NR strategy against it. So, war story real quick. This was NDCA my senior year, and I was debating someone, and it was a Green Hill debater, and I was like, okay, I've been reading the same DisAdL tournament, I need to break a new one against Green Hill that I don't think they'll have prep to, because I'm sure that they've already got answers to the DisAd that I didn't read in the tournament. So I broke a new DisAd, and the impact was terrorism. And this Green Hill debater, first of all, I made a big mistake in not saving. I saved myself about less than 10 seconds of prep for the 2NR. Like, you should never, ever, ever, ever do that. So that was my first massive mistake. The Green Hill debater takes massive advantage of this, gets up without taking basically any prep for the 1AR, and reads 8 impact turn modules on the DisAd. So for 4 minutes, and invests entirely on an 8-minute or on a 4-minute impact turn strategy that I now have less than 10 seconds to prepare answers for. And like, these were all very counterintuitive, and like, I didn't have carded responses to them, and I was very put aback by it. The point is, I stood up and gave a horrible speech, lost the debate with like a 26-5 or a 27 or something like that, I don't remember. And it ended up being a disaster. So the reason I tell this story is just to provide an example in which an impact turn strategy can be very effective, because your judge is receptive to it, your opponent isn't ready to prepare answers to it because they haven't saved themselves enough prep time, or it's so counterintuitive that they wouldn't have prepared answers to it, that it can be an effective strategy to win your debates, especially if you don't have good link turns come. Because the other advantage of impact turns is that you can collect a file of impact turns, right? You know, you can impact turns to this, impact turns to that. And once you have that file collected, it can be a good fallback strategy if you don't have good link turns cut to this end.
Also, on the area of impact turns, 2 things. First, whenever you read an impact turn, you have to make sure that you read impact defense. Can anyone tell me first what impact defense means? Impact defense is where you read a piece of evidence that says, all right, all of this is true. We might get to the point where, like, we have high relations right now with Japan and the kills relations, and we're not going to have a treaty, but that treaty not being passed is not going to cause extinction. Or it's not going to be causing, like, the US and Japan to be body slammed by a giant gorilla, like Godzilla or something ridiculous like that. So impact defense is where you say, all right, everything is true except the impact. The impact will not cause something really bad and awful. Can anyone tell me why you have to read impact defense with an impact turn? Yes?
Because if you're going to turn an impact, you have to make sure it still stands. Basically. So, like...
You're almost there. You're almost there. Try it.
Like, if you get rid of the impact, what's the point of accessing it anymore? So you have to, like, defend it.
You're almost there.
So if you're gonna say that, for example, extinction's good, you have to prove that the act does not lead to that.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you're gonna read impact turns saying that their impact is good, you have to make sure that their impact doesn't cause, like, everyone to die first. So let's say the impact is not extinction. The impact is like economic collapse. And then they have another argument that economic collapse causes extinction. If you want to say economic collapse good, because it leads to all these great things, you first have to say economic collapse does not cause extinction. Because if economic collapse causes extinction, there's no reason for why economic collapse, well, like the economic collapse causing good things won't matter anymore because everyone's going to be dead. Does that make sense? So you can't garner offense off of the impact through impact turning it if you just assume that like their impact won't happen. You got to make arguments about why it won't happen. If you don't read impact defense for some reason, then you can weigh between the probability of your impact turn scenario and the disad itself, but it makes it a lot harder to weigh against a disad if you didn't even answer the disad, like you didn't put defense anywhere on the disad. Does that make sense? Someone explain to me why you need impact defense with impact turns then. Yeah.
So like basically what I'm trying to understand what you're saying is like, when I say like economic collapse is good, like you said, like first you have to disprove economic collapse doesn't lead to extinction. Extinction is good.
Yeah, yeah. And with Jared's story, maybe the impact scenario was like whatever the app does causes more extinction. Causes more terrorism. So it increases the amount of terrorists that there are out there. And then there's probably another argument that an increase in terrorism means that extinction is going to happen because terrorists have all these like super crazy capabilities in order to kill everyone and stuff like that. You first have to prove that terrorists cannot cause extinction. Then you can say an increase in terrorism is good. Okay, second, another reason for why impact turns are especially strategic is because, just like Jared was saying a little bit more, but like a little bit more now, a lot of people don't know how to defend why their impacts are good or bad. They just don't know. In the same way that today in LD, a lot of people don't know how to explain the reasoning behind their arguments. Like, why is freedom good? Why is autonomy good? Why are all these things good? Why is it bad for someone to be coerced into an action? Nowadays, people in the LD realm don't know how to answer those questions, which is kind of not good. But you can take advantage of it. For example, last year at the Green Hill Round Robin, one of my teammates lost to an extinction good impact turn scenario. She was destroying everywhere else on the debate except for on this one impact. And whenever we got back to the room, my coach asked all of us on the team, all right guys, tell me why extinction is bad. And we had no idea how to answer it for like 30 minutes. We had a huge long discussion about why extinction was actually bad. Because every answer that we made, Paul, our coach, would be like, why is that bad? Why is that bad? And there's no reason for, we could not explain why extinction was bad, which is ridiculous. Like extinction, we should be able to explain these things. So, impact turns are super, counterintuitive, so people are not ready for them. They're not ready to defend why their impact is bad. All right, next offensive strategy.
No, hey, that was good. Any other thoughts on impact turns? All right, so the next turn strategy that you can take is the internal link turn. And if you think about it in terms of each internal link is really just a smaller magnitude impact. So losing relations with Japan is still an impact. It's not a terminal impact. It's not really a quantifiable impact, but losing relations with Japan is still an impact. So internal link turns are very similar still in that way to impact turns, but you're just saying that you are taking whatever this is and saying that it's a good thing, right? Or if they say that this internal link is a good thing, you're saying it's a bad thing. Pretty straightforward. But there are two types of internal link turns. There are direct and indirect internal link turns. A direct internal link turn would concede the same impact and turn the internal link to control that impact. So you would say bad relations, like declining relations with Japan is good for is good for the environment. Right, so if the terminal impact of this disad that we have on the board is like global warming causes extinction, right? An internal link turn would be that killing relations with Japan is going to help decrease global warming, right? So that would be a direct internal link turn. An indirect internal link turn creates an entirely separate link chain scenario from the original disad. So it would say something along the lines of bad relations with Japan good because China hates Japan, and if we strengthen relations with, or if we kill relations with Japan, that'll help our relations with China. China relations key to something else, etc. What do you have, if you create an indirect internal link turn chain, what does that mean you have to do with that link chain? versus the original link chain?
Like,
Yeah, you have to weigh. So time frame analysis is pretty important. Same with probability analysis. Seemingly, you're going to try to reach an impact that has the same level of magnitude as the original impact. So if you're going to go with an indirect internal link turn strategy, you have to make sure that you're doing probability and time frame weighing against the original link story. Does that make sense? War story here would be, I was debating sophomore Rebecca Kwong my senior year, and she read a disadvantage that said that it was a politics disadvantage that said the app would prevent the passage of a nuclear arms reduction treaty with between the U.S. and Russia, and that nuclear arms reduction treaty was key to staving off nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia. She did actually something very similar that I did in that previous debate that I talked about, which was not save herself a lot of prep time for the 2NR. And my 1AR was 4 minutes of an indirect internal link turn strategy that created three different new link chains about why the passage of the START treaty would kill U.S.-Israeli relations, which would cause Middle East war. The passage of START, I forgot what the internal link was there, but it was something environment related or global warming related. And the third one was a direct internal link turn that said that the passage of START treaty would cause Russia to preemptively strike the U.S. with nukes and would actually increase the probability of nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia. So, yeah, you can go with an internal link. Oh, and then it was a pretty fast Prio for me because she just it was a sophomore Rebecca Kwong, not like a senior Rebecca Kwong. She would probably have crushed me, like a senior Rebecca Kwong would have crushed me. But she just didn't save herself enough prep time and wasn't prepared to address basically what were essentially new disads, I guess you could say, but they were new link chain stories that she just didn't have answers to. So if you've done your research and can have those kinds of modules prepared, they can certainly be very strategic. So, any questions on internal link turns? So the next thing I want to talk about is really, really important. And this is about avoiding the double turn. Why can't we have a link turn and an impact turn, or a link turn and an internal link turn at the same time? Yeah?
Because, like you said, the impact is good, but he's also stopping that good impact.
Right, exactly. So you say that yeah, exactly what you said.
Like, here's an example of what he just told everyone. So, uniqueness, U.S.-Japan relations right now are high. Link, app kills relations. So you read a link turn and you say, nah, app helps relations. Alright, then internal link says bad relations would mean that we have no treaty. Which, if you just had the regular turn, would be fine because you're helping relations. But if you turn the internal link,
You say bad relations good.
then now you help relations,
But that's a bad thing.
but that's a bad thing.
Right. So your opponent can just stand up and say, extend the link turn, extend the internal link turn. She causes a good thing to happen, or she causes a bad thing to happen. Game over. You don't get to make new responses. You can't, in the next rebuttal be like, nah, I take that back. Right? You just conceded a pretty bad, or you just double turned yourself and put yourself in a pretty terrible situation.
And this can happen, this doesn't just happen with disads. Double turns can happen anywhere on the flow, even if you don't have anything util related to. It can be other types of arguments. You can double turn yourself all the time. So this is something really important to learn, absent disads.
So what does that mean in terms of your offensive strategy when answering disads? Right, you have to invest in one type of turn. So you got to either decide, do we got some impact turns prepped? All right, let's do that. Do we got some link turns prepped? All right, let's do that. I think, in my opinion, the order of what you should cross off the list, you should be all right, do we have link turn prep? No, okay, we don't have link turn prep. Do we have an internal link turn strategy prep? Okay, no. All right, do we have the impact turns prepped at least? Okay, we've got some impact turns prepped. Let's invest in that strategy, right? But you cannot pick multiple of them. You need to invest in one strategy or the other.
Good ways to go about trying to research for answers to diss ads, even though you don't know what diss ads are being read on the topic yet, like it's the first tournament and you have no idea what people are reading, is to first look at the news, look what's going on in the news, something major, for example, like Syria right now, even like Iran or like other places, what's going on that side of the pond as well as over on this side of the pond, really crazy stuff that could end up making huge impacts in terms of like politics, in terms of someone who has access to like really large weapons, I don't know, which is a lot of countries, stuff like that. If you read the news and you know what's going on in countries and you know what's really bad right now or what's like happening in politics, that's one way that you can begin to research as to potential scenarios that will be in diss ads. Because normally what people will do is read a diss ad that's specific to something that's going on right now in current events. But secondly, think about the generic impacts that people read with ETIL. They normally read like econ impacts, they read terrorism impacts, they read like relations impacts. If you like know all those different impacts, then you can research link terms for why your app position helps econ, helps to like decrease terrorism, helps do all these different things. So after you know your app, you can find link terms already to diss ads. So those are two ways that you can help prepare yourself while you're researching prior to the round for diss ads and to answer them.
Yeah, you can also, I mean, you can very easily prepare to answer politics diss ads at any point, even if you don't know what apps or you know what diss ads are necessarily, like what the specific scenarios are going to be, because you can still research arguments like, is the app popular or unpopular, right? And cut cards for both sides. Or you can research things like, you know, is Obama's poll cap high or low now, and prepare for the uniqueness level of that debate, right? So you can still do research for politics disadvantages and other kinds of disadvantages just by keeping up with current events. And I'll just preface, like a big part of disadvantages, considering they all have to do with what is shifting from the status quo, right? The very fact that we're talking about, all right, the app causes this shift from the status quo requires continuous updating on what is happening in the status quo. So running diss ads forces you to be updated on current events, know what's going on in the world, etc.
Yeah, and then also with impacts, I would suggest like investing some time in finding impact terms. You can either cut them yourselves, or you can go to like a bunch of people will post their policy files online on like Open Evidence or something like that. I would not suggest using the evidence that is in there, but it is a good starting point for knowing what type of arguments you should research, because normally that evidence is like not that good. Or if you can't find the arguments again, go to the original article that they cut the piece of evidence from and try to recut it. Don't ever use the cutting that like policy debaters use, because it's either not really that good or it can be miscut.
Yeah.
But if you just spend some time going through and finding those things, then you can like dedicate a couple days to creating an impact turn file, and it won't take that much time. And then you will always be prepared for diss ads, regardless of whether or not you have link terms or you have arguments against their uniqueness or internal link terms, anything like that. You'll always be prepared.
Yeah, so college, yeah, my thoughts on cutting the cards that policy debaters cut would be this. There are a lot of very good college policy debate teams that do cut good cards, like Northwestern, Michigan, Wake Forest, they all cut good cards. But and you can go find all the citations and first 3 words, last 3 words of the cards that they cut on I think it's opencaselist.paperlessdebate.com, I think is where the college policy wiki is, I believe. And you can go on there and look and see what the top college policy debaters are running in terms of their impact turns, in terms of uniqueness challenges to politics diss ads, things like that. But as Shania said, go back to the original source, make sure the evidence isn't miscut, read the card in context, and recut it yourself. because A, a lot of them are bad, and B, third war story of the lecture. In the debate, we're about, well, I won't say in the debate, well. So a few years ago at the Tournament of Champions, a certain debater who is very well known read a disadvantage, and it was discovered several months later that said debater was reading a card that was radically miscut in said dissad. And that debater won a lot of rounds reading that dissad. The issue that occurred was that that debater's coach had cut a card from a college policy file, or I don't know if it's college policy, but a policy file, but did not go back and check the original source. He just cut the card as it was, sent it to his debater, and he plugged it into the dissad, right? After it was discovered that the card was radically miscut, the debater's coach, issued a public apology and was like, I should have gone back and looked at the original source. I didn't know that it was miscut. I'm sorry, right? All that to say, it is not uncommon for policy debaters to miscut evidence, right? So make sure that you go and you check the original source to make sure you don't find yourself in a situation that you don't want to be in.
Yeah, and this is not specific to policy debaters. It's not specific to, or not only specific to policy debaters, and not only specific to people who have, like one person who had read a miscut piece of evidence in the past. This happens a lot, and that's because debaters are sometimes really lazy, and they'll just read the cards that their teammates cut. They'll read the cards that they trade with other debaters, that they're just like, oh, I'll give you this file if you give me this file, and stuff like that. You should always read the article for any card that you cut. Any card that you read within the debate round, you should have read either all or the majority of the article from which the card was cut. Because that will, A, help you to know the context behind the card, so that if someone asks you a question, you know exactly how to answer it. Because normally, whoever writes, like people who write like articles, they'll answer common objections to it and stuff like that, so you'll better debate with it. And B, you'll make sure it isn't miscut, which happens often, and people don't even know that they're miscutting off like evidence that often, because a lot of people don't know what it means to miscut a card. They just think they're cutting it strategically, stuff like that.
So yeah, that was any thoughts on any other thoughts on cutting from college files? Yeah, that was kind of a tangent, but I do have a section in here. It's at the bottom of the lecture, and I'll go into a little bit about researching for dissads. But this was kind of a good discussion. So yeah.
Just randomly, like, what if someone runs a completely like wacky dissad and you don't have like cards cut for it?
I think that a lot of people should be able to answer back dissads analytically. And people just assume that they can't answer dissads analytically. They're like, I don't have a card. Okay, just gonna leave that dissad there. Hopefully everyone forgets about it or something like that. Or I'm gonna try to outweigh. But it's really, really easy, at least to cast insane amounts of doubt on the dissad by making simple little analytic arguments. And we'll actually explain this in just a second, because most of the time analytics are defensive in nature, because it's hard to generate offense on something that you don't have a piece of evidence for, because it, like, especially in like current event scenarios, unless you know so much about politics and what's going on in the world,
right.
Because it's just, we're not that credible. People who are credible would be like news sources that have people reporting from the instances and what's happening. But, however, you still can make analytical turns that are just logical. You can make a bunch of defensive arguments, and that's a great segue into the next section.
Well, yeah. I guess one more thing I'll say on top of that is just that if you're going to engage a dissad analytically, it just requires immense knowledge, right, about what's going on, because it's mostly rooted in current events in the world, right? So you just have to, if you do keep up with current events and you're knowledgeable about what's going on in the world and you're knowledgeable about what's going on in Washington, D.C., et cetera, then, you should be able to come up with analytical answers to the dissad, and that's perfectly okay. It's just easier if, it's generally it's easier if you have cards from people that are, insiders in those particular areas or experts in those particular areas that are, a lot more knowledgeable than we are about exactly what's going on in those particular areas.
Can you explain the make sure you weigh again?
Oh, yeah. So, it's really, really important, regardless of any debate, if you read util and disad or not, to weigh between your arguments. So, you need to weigh between the impacts of arguments, especially in the util debate, because a lot of times, you'll just like make, oh, like here's a link turn, nobody weighs between them, and the judge doesn't know exactly what to do. In the same way, you'll read an impact on the app, the disad that your opponent reads will have an impact as well, and we don't know which one comes first. So a great way to make the debate lean in your favor in those instances is to weigh. You can weigh via like probability, time frame, magnitude, etc. And what those things mean, like really quickly, like probability is like how, like the chance of your impact happening. So like the chance of me dropping this pin on the floor was 100% because I dropped the pin on the floor. But like it's pretty high anyways if I'm holding it right here and I'm about to drop it, that the probability of me dropping the pin is pretty high. The probability of me throwing this pin all the way to China is not very high because one, I don't even have like near that type of strength to even like throw it across the room. And two, it's impossible for me to throw a pin all the way to China. Does that make sense? So that's where you can weigh probability issues. Time frame. Time frame is important because people will make arguments about why their impact is going to happen first, the other person's impact is going to happen later, those sort of things. If your impact is going to happen first, then then that's probably a reason for why your impact should take precedence. Like if a giant gorilla is about to body slam me in 2 seconds, I'm going to care a lot more about that giant gorilla body slamming me in 2 seconds than the potential of me like my computer falling on the floor in like 3 days or something like that. So even though those are pretty like bad impacts, both of them. Let me think of another one. Maybe like my pet dying or something like that. I'll care more about the fact that there is a giant gorilla about to attack me in 2 seconds than some other impact that's going to happen later down the road. And then with magnitude. Magnitude is just like how large of an impact it is. So like the big gorilla attacking me is a pretty large impact because it will probably like crush all the bones in my body. If I were to, like, if someone threw this pin at me, it wouldn't be that big of an impact because while it might like sting for a second, if someone threw a pin at me, it's not going to hurt that much. Does that make sense? So those are just a couple examples of ways that you can weigh, and they're really important just to make sure that you can have the debate lean your way, especially in the util debate, but not only in the util debate. You can weigh between evidence, you can weigh between arguments, regardless if you read util.
So like for impacts, like for example, like the extinction argument, how would you justify like extinction is good?
So a lot of people will say that extinction is good because like there's no longer any pain in the world. If you die, there's not a chance of you having pain anymore, right? So that's what a lot of people will say. Obviously, those type of things are flawed because, well, yes, if everyone dies, we won't have pain anymore, but that also means that there's no chance of anyone having happiness anymore. And we can't have happiness now, we can't have happiness tomorrow, our children can't have happiness, and the generations in the future can't have happiness either. So that, like, all those type of arguments are flawed in some way, and that's just like a simple example. But yeah, that's just one way that someone would say that extinction was a good thing.
Yeah.
Or they might say extinction of almost everyone is a good thing because the earth is getting like super overpopulated right now, so that's going to lead to people fighting over resources, lots of crazy events happening, lots of wars, stuff like that. So if everyone were to die except for like, I don't know, a couple hundred people, then we could slowly regenerate and repopulate the earth, and those people would live great lives because they have like access to as much resources as they want, as much everything else that they want, you know, like that.
The weirdest one I've heard is extinction good because there's a significant probability of alien life existing. We will develop the technology to discover alien life in the next however many years, and humans are innately colonialist. History proves that once we are able to develop the technology to encounter alien life, that we will then begin to colonize their planets and start committing genocides of other species species of life on other planets, and colonization is bad. that was a pretty terrible argument, but that was just the crazy. It's the point I'm trying to make is probably most arguments for why extinction is good are probably pretty ridiculous.
Even more ridiculous than this dissad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So think about like if you're gonna do like an indirect link term, like an indirect internal link term. You said you would like have to weigh like indirect internal link terms. What does that mean?
So you would weigh, like, let's say in this scenario we talked about where well, let's talk about this story. Like, so in the story that I told earlier about the nuclear arms reduction treaty. So one of the indirect internal link terms I read was that the START treaty, or the nuclear arms reduction treaty between the U.S. and Russia, would kill U.S. relations with Israel, and that would cause a Middle East war. So I would have to weigh between the risk of the START treaty causing Middle East war via U.S. collapse of relations with Israel versus the risk of the START treaty preventing nuclear war between U.S. and Russia. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'd have to weigh between the probability of both those. The way that I could leverage that is with some defensive arguments about why START would not, some defensive arguments about why, like, for example, maybe Russia would listen to START or like wouldn't adhere to START. So even if it passed, like Russia wouldn't care and they would secretly continue to develop arms. So right, that would be a takeout to one of their arguments. And then I can weigh the risk of, I can say, look, START isn't going to do crap to prevent U.S.-Russian nuclear war. Russia's going to continue to develop nuclear weapons secretly. But the probability is very high that if past starts, it's going to kill U.S.-Israeli relations and cause nuclear war. Or I can also say that, so that would be probability weighing. I could also say U.S.-Russian nuclear war wouldn't occur for another 20 years. But if we pass START, the instability in the Middle East will result in almost immediate Middle Eastern war due to the collapse of U.S.-Israeli relations. So I outweigh on time frame because U.S.-Israeli war in the world where START passes, or like Israeli conflict in the Middle East would happen within a few months of START passing, but U.S.-Russian nuclear war is still 20 years off.
All right, and then just to go alongside what we were explaining before, so remember our example dissad is U.S.-Jap relations high right now, AFCIL's relations, bad relations is bad because there's no treaty between the U.S. and Japan, and no treaty leads to like some awful impact. So an indirect internal link term would be like U.S.-Jap relations bad, removal of U.S.-Jap relations would lead to U.S.-China relations, and then U.S.-China relations good, and then you'd say, and U.S.-China relations are more important than having no treaty, and it outweighs because it's more probable, it happens faster, stuff like that. Any more questions about offensive answers to disseds? Cool. Let's start with defense.
Awesome. So first thing I will say is that defense on disseds is very rarely terminal, unless you're able to make some kind of like no link argument, like your app is a plan that talks about China and their dissad link is about Saudi Arabia, right? Like unless there's just no link, right? There's always going to be some risk of the dissad if you just put defense. So obviously, and just like this is just true for like debate in general, but obviously offensive strategies are preferable to purely defensive strategies. The other reason why like you should focus on offense first if it is possible is because let's say you make a bunch of link terms and you now control access to the impact. But then you have also gone and put a bunch of defense on the impact. What can your opponent do that now has screwed your 1AR strategy? Assuming that they have offense besides the dissent, which a good debater will hopefully have more offense besides just one dissent. So you turn the link, say that app helps relations, but you also put defense on the impact. What can they do? No, they haven't double turned themselves because they're not turning the impact. They're just putting a bunch of defense on the impact. So you say you control the link to the impact, but the impact is improbable because for XYZ defensive arguments. I mean, it doesn't necessarily go away because you're just mitigating the risk of your own offense, right? You're decreasing the probability of your own offense being true, right? So they can just stand up, assuming, let's say, they read a disad and then they have turns on the AC that they can go for, right? And you turn the link and then put a bunch of impact defense. They can just say, extend the impact defense, link turn goes away, I will outweigh with the turns on the app. I will outweigh the link turn with the turns that I'm making on the AC. Does that make sense to everyone? You look a little confused? No? You got it? Yes. So, let's say I am winning. So the original link is app kills US-Japanese relations. Okay? So now in the 1AR, I say turn the app helps US-Japanese relations. But I also say that global warming won't cause extinction, global warming isn't real, global warming isn't probable, right? Or like death from global warming isn't probable, it's not a big deal, right? So the advantage, like the strategic value of a link turn is to say that I now control the link to that global warming extinction impact, right? The app, what used to be a negative impact now becomes an affirmative impact once you win a link turn. But if you are winning a link turn, but also making all these arguments about why global warming doesn't exist and it's improbable, then you have just mitigated mitigated the very own impact that you have just gained access to. Does that make sense now? Okay. Do I need to rephrase that explanation at all again? I know it's kind of like thought process, but everybody got it? Okay. So yeah, with that said, committing to an offensive strategy, if you have it, is the most ideal situation. But if you don't have the ability to generate offense on the disad, you can also have a defensive heavy strategy. Well, what does that then require you to do with your app? Right, considering the fact that defense is rarely terminal, and the fact that considering the fact that defense is rarely terminal, what do you have to do in addition to making defensive responses to the disad in order to have an effective strategy? Yeah. Okay, yeah, you have to generate offense elsewhere. You have a 1AC, right? That seemingly has offense. So what, not just generating offense, but what do you have to do specifically? We kind of talked about it already. Starts with a W. Yeah, you have to weigh, right? If you're just putting defense on the disad, but the defense is not terminal, right? There's still a risk of that disad happening. You then have to weigh the probability of the 1AC's impacts versus the probability of the disad's impacts, or the time frame of the 1AC's impacts versus the time frame of the disad. That is an essential step because of the fact that defense on disads is rarely terminal. Because they can just stand up, if you don't do any weighing, and they just put defense, they can stand up and spin the disad, as I've heard so many other times, right? Like, people, I'm sure if you've been in some, seen some circuit debate rounds, I hate it. I love util as much as the next person, but I hate it when they're like, Bostrom means that extinction comes first, no other impacts matter. If I win a 0.0111% risk of the disad being true, that means you vote negative, right? I think that's some BS.
It commits the max magnetic fallacy, too. Just saying.
So if you don't want to let the 2NR stand up and be able to spin the disad in that fashion. So you just want to make sure that you have weighing against it to say that, no, it's not, if you win, that there's a 0.01 risk of the disad being true. That doesn't mean we vote negative because I've got high magnitude, high probability offense to weigh against that.
What do you mean in defensive matchups, like rarely?
So
if I say, let's say I make arguments about why, like the app, like Japan doesn't really like the app, but it's not going to kill relations. Or, and I make some arguments about why, like the impact of global warming is really low. It's not going to cause any extinction, etc. Right? There is still a risk that the app is going to kill relations, and there is still a risk that global warming will cause extinction, even if the probability of that has been decreased due to my answers, right? So there is still a risk that all of this is true, unless you are turning it to say that it is true for you rather than your opponent, right? So in that case, it's not terminal. What I mean by terminal is that, like, we can just cross the disad off the flow, right? Where if you make just defensive arguments, we can't be like, disad goes away, right? There's still a risk of it being true. Does that make sense? So, yeah, so we already talked about impact defense. You can also just make analytical responses, defensive responses about why the probability of the link is low. Like, app isn't going to hurt relations that bad. It might hurt them a little bit, but it's not going to be that big of a deal. You can make arguments about why, even if U.S.-Japanese relations are killed, it's not going to do that much to it. It's not going to really affect the passage of the treaty, right? It's not going to, there might be some impact on relations. There might be a shift in international politics a little bit, but in terms of the treaty, it's not going to really do anything, right? Those are some examples of defensive arguments that you can make. But I also want to talk about uniqueness arguments, because that's kind of a different breed of defensive responses that you can make to the dissent. So, what would be a uniqueness challenge to this? If uniqueness says U.S.-Japanese relations high, okay, well, sure, you can question the recency of uniqueness, but that is better when paired with a piece of evidence that says what? Yeah.
U.S.-Japanese relations low?
Yeah, exactly. So if you have a piece of evidence from 2 hours ago that says, no, U.S.-Japanese relations low, and their evidence is from 3 months ago, right, then you can make a recency argument to explain why we should prefer your uniqueness evidence over the opponent's uniqueness evidence. Why? What does that do for the rest of the dissad if you win that U.S.-Japanese relations are low now? Why?
Because for the uniqueness is a problem that the neg is saying that the app is not the app violates the uniqueness is good, but if the uniqueness is different.
Well, if U.S.-Japanese relations are low already, what does that mean in terms of the link? Yeah. Okay, how's that?
Because like their uniqueness says that it's high, and now that you say it's low, everything that they say like to the impact point, it would actually be the opposite because it's not.
Well, would it be the
Not
opposite?
They
like
can't
it
say
wouldn't
that.
happen.
They
Okay.
can't say that the app is making it lower because it's already.
Exactly. So you can't say that the app is making something that's already lower, right? So it's a significant defensive takeout. I mean, there is still, again, it's not terminal. There is still a risk that this could happen. But if you're able to prove that, no, U.S.-Japanese relations are not high now. In fact, they're terrible. Like, Japan hates us. There's no way that they're going to cooperate with us. It can significantly decrease the probability of the dissent being true, right? Which makes weighing then much, much easier.
Now, the higher you go up on the dissad, the better strength your defense is going to have against the dissad.
Yeah, if you are making defensive arguments, it's always a good idea to aim high on the link chain first and work your way down if you're going for a defensive heavy strategy. So that is a basic, like a very basic uniqueness challenge. Just saying a piece of evidence that says that no, what's going on in the status quo is actually the opposite of what you say. Now I want to talk about what happens if you pair a uniqueness challenge with a link term. So if we say U.S.-Japanese relations low and the app strengthens relations, what has that done to your link term? right, so this would be what we call a straight turn in jargon. I'm sure you've heard the people talk, like say, supercharges the link, right? This is an example of how a uniqueness press can supercharge your link turn. Because if you concede that US-Japanese relations are high now, and the app strengthens relations, it's kind of the same thing of what we just talked about in terms of what a uniqueness press does for the negative. If you concede that US-Japanese relations are high now, and the link turn says that the app strengthens relations, your link turn really isn't that strong, because you're just strengthening something that's already strong, right? But if you make a uniqueness argument that says no, they're actually really low now, and the app is what restores those relations, then you have just increased the probability of your link turn being true in the context of the disadvantage impact. Does that make sense? So whenever possible, you want to control uniqueness and link turn the argument, and that would be called a straight turn. That's probably, in my opinion, the most strategic way that you can engage a disad substantively is by controlling uniqueness and turning the link, because you have now access to their impact, and it's a very high probability that link turn is true if you're controlling uniqueness. Any questions on straight turning the disad? Okay, I think I don't know if Shania agrees with me, but I think in terms of engaging a disad substantively, straight turning is the most optimal.
Yeah.
Can be the most optimal strategy.
Gotcha.
Other forms of uniqueness presses, you can say, running out of time, so I'll just go through this very fast. You can say uniqueness overwhelms the link, which is basically saying that it's basically a fancy way of saying there are alternate causes, alternate causalities of the link, right? So, for example, if you say uniqueness overwhelms the link, you would say that the status quo, i.e. uniqueness, if uniqueness is the status quo, uniqueness overwhelms the link says that the status quo and other factors in the status quo will cause the link to happen anyway, regardless of the app. So for example, let's say that the app is, well, let's just use the resolution. This is kind of nonsense, but let's say the neg says that the app providing a living wage to its citizens is going to kill US-Japanese relations, right? This is a great example. This is actually a great example in which you can make a uniqueness overwhelms the link argument, because you can say, sure, I mean, you might have some evidence that says that Japan cares a little bit, but there are so many other things going on in the international arena that Japan cares a lot more about than whether or not the US mandates a living wage for its citizens, right? So there are a lot of other factors that are going to kill US-Japanese relations, regardless of whether or not we do the app, which means that the link is very insignificant in terms of the grand scheme of the status quo. Does that make sense? This is very true for like relations disads and soft power disads. You can make uniqueness overwhelms the link arguments all the time, unless they have like very, very specific link evidence about why the app influences relations.
Yeah. Uniqueness overwhelms the link is also like one of those arguments that you really don't have to have any other background knowledge for in terms of answering the disad. Literally any disad that you debate will probably have like pretty strong uniqueness. And so you can always make those type of arguments. US-Jap relations are too high right now. The app will not harm them in some really significant way. There are other factors that play into US-Jap relations, and that's the very top of the disad. It makes it so much less probable that every other argument, the link, the internal link, however many internal links there are, and the impacts are going to happen.
The last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you go, is in terms of uniqueness presses, is that each level of the link chain has its own, requires its own uniqueness, right? So if you're able to put uniqueness presses on the link, the internal link, and the impact, right, to explain why all of those things are inevitable or why there's no uniqueness to any of those. So for example, uniqueness takeout to this internal link would say that the treaty isn't going to pass anyway, right? So if this would say bad US-Japanese relations result in no treaty passing, but you can make uniqueness arguments about how the status quo is going to prevent the treaty from passing regardless of the act, right? And the uniqueness takeout on here would say that extinction via global warming is going to happen regardless of whatever we do, so the impact is still inevitable, right? And if you can make those types of uniqueness presses on each of the links of the link chain, then you can significantly decrease the probability, and then you weigh against that with the risk of the app. Any other questions? I will say that if you want to watch But if you go Google like Victory Briefs videos and go to their Vimeo page, where like they have a series, like probably a dozen different videos. One of them on there is the 2009 semifinals debate between Chris Tice and Jake Nebel. Chris reads a diss ad about Sudan, and Jake's 1AR responding to it integrates all of what we're talking about, some uniqueness takeouts, some turns, etc. So if you want to watch a good example of substantively engaging a diss ad, I suggest you go find that video.
And if you have any more questions that you think about afterwards, feel free to come up to us anytime for questions during office hours in Clark. That also give you back anything. So
Thank you. You're welcome. Go to the left.